Well, welcome to this, what we're calling the 50 Years Strong and Earth Day event. We've got our friends from Riverkeeper and Scenic Hudson and Clearwater here joining me. We're going to talk, I think the focus is going to be on the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, which is celebrating that prestigious date this year in 2022. My name is John Bowermaster. I'm a proud resident of the Hudson Valley since 1988. I'm a writer and a filmmaker. I started as a print journalist, and 32 years ago, on this date or on Earth Day, I published a book called "Saving the Earth: A Citizen's Guide to Environmental Action." And I get it out every Earth Day just to remind myself of how we're doing. The book was looked at the causes, effects, and solutions to about 16 different environmental issues around the world. And I get it out every year on Earth Day to kind of see how we're doing. And this year, because of the conversation we're having today, I specifically looked for freshwater in the freshwater pollution chapter. And there, the very #1 solution was the passage of the 1972 Clean Water Act. And then a few paragraphs down, it says the evidence of this legislation working is the shining example of the Hudson River Fishermen's Association and its watchboat, the Riverkeeper. So I've been writing about this stuff, paying attention to this stuff, even though not a Hudson Valley resident until 1988. But I kind of morphed into making films, and I've had the good fortune to make films literally around the world, including a couple in Antarctica. But about a decade ago, I started, kind of recognizing that you didn't have to travel halfway around the world to find good adventure and to find good environmental stories. And so we started making films about our backyard here in the Hudson Valley. I think we're extremely fortunate here and a little bit spoiled to a certain degree by having these 3 big environmental groups representing us. I think sometimes we even may take them for granted and may think that we may not think enough about the hard work they do. We've made more than 20 of these short films about Hudson River issues, and I've taken them up and down the river and around the state, et cetera. And I'm convinced, and I'd like to explore with Ned and Tracy and David this in a little bit. I'm convinced that there are more environmental activists in the Hudson Valley per capita than anywhere in the country. A little of that's regional bias, but having been out there, I think it's true. But anyway, I'll remind you guys of that, and we'll talk about it a bit. Per instruction, I do have some housekeeping stuff to go over. We're recording this, and it's going to be available on everybody's websites, Scenic Hudson, Riverkeeper, and Clearwater, sometime after the weekend. So pay attention to scenichudson.org, riverkeeper.org, and clearwater.org. There is closed captioning option if anyone wants it, and I also understand that it's going to be translated into Spanish. So next week, if you think of anyone who would like to see it in that version, it'll be available. You can add questions to the chat kind of anytime you want. We've got some questions that we're going to talk about, but if you want to chime in, we're going to try and get to as many of them as we can. And just be sure and do look at those websites again, because they'll have follow-ups to this conversation, but all sorts of other good stuff as well. But the subject is the Clean Water Act of 1972. To really explain it best, I'm actually going to read a definition of what the law did. I could wing it, but I wouldn't cover all the bases. Clean Water Act establishes the basic structure for regulating discharges of pollutants into the waters of the United States and regulating quality standards for surface waters. Before the Clean Water Act was passed, many waterways across the United States were severely contaminated by sewage, trash, oil, and toxic industrial pollution. At the time, Senator Ed Muskie said that 1/3, this is as they were debating the Clean Water Act, he said 1/3 of America's rivers and streams and lakes are unswimmable. 1/3. So that was in 1972. These waterways are unsafe for water supplies, fish consumption, or even human contact in many cases. Rivers caught on fire, communities were sick, and wildlife disappeared. In response to this devastation, Congress passed the Clean Water Act on October 18, 1972. This monumental law prohibits pollution and requires restoration of the nation's waters. Its purpose is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, whether on public or private land. It authorizes the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to set water quality criteria for states to use to establish water quality standards. Under this law, all waters that are defined as waters of the United States are federally protected against pollution under strict standards that are meant to protect drinking water, wildlife, recreation, and many other uses. If you go to the chat, we're going to put the link to the EPA's info up on the screen. I was going to talk to you about Richard Nixon, but now my screen is filled with other images. That's funny. But sometimes it's mistakenly reported that Richard Nixon and the Republicans created the Clean Water Act, but that's not exactly true. I've heard lots of people, including Christine Todd Whitman, who was former head of the EPA, attribute the passage of the Clean Water Act to Nixon. And in fact, Nixon vetoed the rule, saying it was too expensive. And the veto was overturned by both the Senate and the Congress by sizable votes. And then the budget bill that included what was then $24 billion for the Clean Water Act. The budget bill was passed quite by big numbers. And the Senate passed it 74-0, and the House 366-11. So even with Republicans in charge, and a lot of the voters in the Senate especially were Republicans. So Nixon is sometimes given credit, but wasn't really Nixon. It was a lot of Republicans in the House and Senate. At the time, in 1972, the Hudson was amongst those most polluted in the country. I don't know how many of you would remember that, but it's changed quite a bit, and that's why we're here today, is to talk about how this kind of this somewhat complicated legislation has helped the Hudson River and helped the Hudson Valley. But first, I want to introduce you to our guests here. David Thomann, I only met on the Zoom today, which is fantastic, as the new chief at Clearwater. But everyone knows the boat, everyone knows the group. The River Sloop Clearwater is a member-supported nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve the Hudson by connecting people of all ages with the river and its watershed. Organization owns and operates the 106-foot Hudson River Sloop Clearwater, which we've all seen and hopefully we've all been on. If you've not, make this summer a priority. Clearwater is recognized for unparalleled environmental education programs, thus the boat moving up and down the river, through which hundreds of thousands of students have investigated the ecology, history, and environmental challenges of the Hudson Valley. David came to Clearwater just recently in January of 2022 with over 25 years of experience in nonprofit leadership. While his career began in the public accounting world, his love of nature guided him to the Delaware Nature Society as Associate Director of Business and Finance, and then to the Mohonk Preserve as Vice President of Operations and Chief Financial Officer. In addition to the decades of professional experience, David comes face to face with many of the Hudson Valley's environmental obstacles as a lover of paddling on our local waterways and hiking through the Hudson Valley's many trails. He is dedicated to the preservation of and the ability to access this important resource. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, David. Who's next? Tracy? Sure. Also relatively new to the Riverkeeper job. You'd had a stint there previously at Riverkeeper for 7 years or so, and now you're back. Now you're back as the president, which is great. As we referenced in the years leading up to 1972 and the passage of the Clean Water Act, the Hudson was in big trouble. And it was the fishermen of the Hudson River who decided they had had enough and banded together to use a decades-old federal law to turn the tide from ruin to recovery. And so the Hudson River Fishermen's Association was founded, the fledgling but mighty group that would become what is now Riverkeeper, and has spawned how many Riverkeeper groups around the world?
There are over 300 around the world. Yeah.
Nice. Today, Riverkeeper continues its fight to protect the Hudson River from polluters and to work with partners like Clearwater and Scenic Hudson, as well as other local communities, volunteers, and activists. Riverkeeper envisions a future in which the Hudson River and its tributaries and watershed and the New York City drinking watershed are free-flowing, teeming with life and healthy and safe for all. Tracy became president of Hudson Riverkeeper in 2021. A recognized leader in clean water advocacy, Tracy brings a multidisciplinary approach to Riverkeeper, prioritizing data-driven, community-oriented strategies to realize the mission. She previously served as Regional Director of Water Protection at Save the Sound, establishing their New York office. Before that, Brown worked at Riverkeeper for 7 years and was instrumental in developing Riverkeeper's water quality monitoring program. Resident of Sleepy Hollow, Brown is a founder of the Peabody Preserve Outdoor Classroom and is currently co-chair of the Water Committee for the Westchester County Climate Crisis Task Force. Thanks, Tracy. And then last but not least, the elder statesman, Ned Sullivan with the Scenic Hudson. You know, Scenic Hudson loves the river and lands and communities along it. Since 1963, it's been showing its love by protecting and connecting people to the valley's natural splendor. The organization began when 6 people came together to stop an industrial project from defacing iconic Storm King Mountain. Eventually, thousands of others and dozens of groups, including the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, now Riverkeeper, and Clearwater, joined their campaign, which took 17 years to preserve the mountain's majesty. During this campaign, Scenic Hudson achieved a landmark court victory that gave people the legal right to press their cases against projects that could impact their enjoyment of the environment. This ruling, called the Scenic Hudson decision, is considered the birth of America's modern environmental movement. I want to explore that a little bit later too, so don't let me forget. Scenic Hudson has continued forging partnerships to make the region a better place for all to live, work, and play by transforming industrial riverfronts into spectacular public parks, conserving 52,000 acres of land, including over 130 family farms, strengthening its mission to restore natural resources in the valley's river cities, and with Clearwater Riverkeeper, assuring a comprehensive PCB cleanup, which is also in the news these days. Scenic Hudson's president since 1999. What's the math on that, Ned? 22, 23 years? Ned has directed the organization through dramatic growth and impact. Under his leadership, it has preserved thousands of acres of open space and farmland, opened a dozen organizations starting to take shape around protecting the river from further damages and pollution and restoring it for future generations to use and enjoy. It's actually, in my experience, it's rare to see all groups under one roof on one Zoom call, so I'm very impressed by all the efforts made to attract this gang. Maybe we'll start off with a question about for Ned. Again, I'll let you go first. You know, in your introduction, it suggests that the American environmental movement may have started along the Hudson River. How do we? I happen to agree with you, but how do we explain that to the public at large?
Well, thanks, John. Thanks for your role today, and thanks for all you do to magnify our voices through your wonderful films and videos, and by getting out on the river in kayaks together. I think it's fairly widely accepted that the dawning of the modern environmental movement traces its history back to the Storm King case that you talked about, where Scenic Hudson, where our founders sued to stop Con Edison from building a pump storage power plant on the north face of Storm King Mountain, a beautiful iconic mountain in the Hudson Highlands. It would have blasted the northern face off of it and pumped hundreds of millions of gallons of water from the Hudson every day, stored it up in a reservoir that would have flooded what is now Black Rock Forest, and then run it back down through a turbine to generate peak period electricity in New York City. And the project would have been net energy negative, but would have made a profit for Con Edison because they would be selling it at the peak prices. So, you know, it didn't make sense from an environmental and energy perspective back then, but it made sense from a bottom line perspective for Con Edison. But back then, there were no laws, there were no rules that gave citizens a voice in decisions like that. It was basically going to be rubber stamped through state and federal agencies until our founders stood up and said, no, this is crazy. We're going to stop this. And as you pointed out, John, they didn't stop trying for 17 years until they were finally successful. But a couple of years into that long campaign, there was a crucial judicial decision that granted our founders legal standing to be in court opposing this project on behalf of the people of the Hudson Valley and on behalf of the environment. And that Scenic Hudson decision really laid the foundation of a whole body of environmental laws, including the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, many of which all of which have public involvement, public comment provisions, many of which even have citizen litigation provisions. So citizens can sue to enforce the laws. So every time you or I or anyone in our audience stands up in a public hearing or meeting and says they're in favor of a project that's going to impact their environment or their community, or they're opposing it, they can trace that back to that Scenic Hudson decision and the battle to protect Storm King that our founders and that Riverkeeper and Clearwater's founders all came together to advance and ultimately to win. And those provisions, many of the provisions of the National Environmental Policy Act, which is this country's seminal environmental law, go back to that. The idea that the public has a voice, the idea that the proponents of a project have to do an environmental impact statement and an alternatives analysis, and that science gets to be entered into the debate, and that that the scenic resources, the beauty of the area can be a factor, and historic resources. All of those things and many more that are in the National Environmental Policy Act and many state environmental quality review acts around the country go back to that Scenic Hudson decision.
And then specifically in regard to the Clean Water Act of 1972, what difference did that make on the Hudson? Can you think of a couple examples?
Well, the big one, John, on the Hudson and on waterways all around the country was that the Clean Water Act provided grants to states and municipalities that enabled them to build sewage treatment plants. And so, the very first efforts to stop raw sewage from going into our waterways was financed through billions and billions of dollars of federal money that was typically matched at the state level and began to stop that discharge of raw sewage. So, that's the good news. The bad news is that many states and municipalities, including those along the Hudson, didn't go far enough and didn't keep investing in the wastewater infrastructure, including the systems that would prevent storm water from overflowing and going into the Hudson. And so, today, John, when you and I are out kayaking, after a storm, we don't want to go in the water because those storms overflow the capacity of the river to treat the sewage. So we end up with raw sewage, and that's something that is a legacy that we really still need to address, and something that Tracy and David and I should all work together to continue to address in the future.
Yeah, and Tracy and David, maybe you guys can trade turns on where you see the role of activism in the Hudson Valley. I threw out that notion that the Hudson Valley is filled with environmental activists. Do you guys feel like you're surrounded by like-minded people? And if so, how are we doing in regard to a cleaner Hudson River?
Yeah. So, all right, I'll take a turn, David. Let's see how we doing. So, yeah, I think there are definitely a lot of activists in the Hudson Valley, and we in the Hudson Valley and in New York State, we're modeling a lot of good practices for sure. That is one of the privileges of doing this work here, is that New York can be a mark holder, a trailblazer in best practices. So I would say we definitely have a high awareness and a high commitment to do this work, for sure. To the other part of your question, John, about kind of where we are at this point in time, I would say, you know, when the Clean Water Act passed 50 years ago, the real focus was on industrial polluters and the lack of wastewater treatment. So a lot of it was kind of focused on the bad guys, you know, they, them, get those guys, make them do the right thing. And over time, as we've succeeded to get a lot of those kind of major egregious polluters, the GEs, the GMs, the Exxons, to stop doing that and used the laws to that effect, and also the Superfund laws to work on cleanups. We have gotten to a point where people want to get back in the river, want to live on the river. And now really this new era that we're in is that the stressor is us. It's our communities. It's almost, you know, like a child kind of squeezing a kitten, you know, till it can't get air anymore. We're definitely at risk of maybe loving it to death with our developments and the heavy footprint that we have on this waterway along our communities. So, you know, I like to tell people when they talk about water quality that the Hudson and all of our waterways are really a mirror to that community that lives right there on that waterway. So when people look at things like, you know, do I have swimming beaches? Can I pull out a fish and eat it? Can I drink this water? And if the answer is no, which in too many cases it is, you really don't have to look that much far these days than your own community and how you are engaged with the water and take that responsibility and do that hard work. And I think one manifestation of that shift that is positive is, you know, the Clean Water Act was passed with the first Earth Day, which was really the pressure point that finally got that overwhelming support that you were talking about, John, to get it passed and to override the presidential veto. And now Earth Day is all of us, everyone on this call, all these engaged folks you're talking about in our communities, setting up tables in our local parks and bringing out solar panels or reusable water bottles, or, you know, whatever the issue is locally, to say we have to live better on this land. And I think that is the conversation we should be having. So, you know, it's hopeful. At the same time that we have more pressure and more stressors from climate, we are also having so much more awareness and willingness for people to take responsibility than even I saw when I started doing this work 15 years ago. So that's hopeful.
Mm. Yeah. Hopeful is good. David, what are you thinking about?
You asked about activism now. Yeah. I think we want to look at the history of activism, right, in regards to Clean Water Act. It was back in 1970 that the Congress held an environmental teach-in, and the Clearwater, by following our founder Pete Seeger, sailed down to the Potomac. So this is a boat. This is a sloop built for what was in the 19th century commerce along the Hudson, and they sailed it out in the ocean and brought it down to and up the Potomac and sailed to Congress and delivered tens of thousands of signatures requesting that something get done. And so I think that's where, you know, activism has always played a part that they eventually get listened to, and that took place in 1970. That helped drive the decision that was and the legislation that was passed in 1972. So activism today, I think, continues off of that theme. It's really important that people stay educated. And that education begins like we do with the Sloop, with children being brought out when they're young and in school, and learning about the river and appreciating the river from being right out there on the water, and then learning various stations of environmental education during the process. But they gain a personal appreciation for it that you hope carries forward. And they become, so if you think about it, we're talking 1972. I know where I was in 1972 in age, and you think about how those people are now the players, right? They're the ones now making the decisions of what are we doing from this point forward. And there's so much we need to do in regards yet around the river, in arguing for policies and protecting for all those great purposes. And so we need to keep people engaged. We need to rally them up. And you know, in today's day and age, one of our big challenges is noise, right? There's so much information overload on so many things. And where are people going to participate, and where are they going to put their energies and time? And so activism becomes a really important role that our organizations can do to bring people into making this a priority when they look at everything they want to pay attention to, so that we do stay active and we do work towards the future. But the problems are going to continue. So we need to keep also raising that next generation, so the activists are still here in 25 years from now.
Well, you know, I showed this book before, the Saving the Earth book. It was written in 1988, 1989. And that was when James Hansen, then the head of NASA, had appeared before Congress and used the phrase global warming for the first time in public. And that was in 1988. In 1972, when they passed the Clean Water Act, there was no mention of climate change or global warming, but that is the combination is a huge issue on waterways around the world, from oceans to river. Anyone with a shoreline or a coast living on a coast has to be concerned about climate change. Maybe I'd like all of you to address that. What are the potential harms of climate change here in the Hudson River and the Hudson Valley? Things that are hard to address by legislation, but we're making efforts now.
So
Go for it, Ned.
I can take a shot, sure. Yeah, as you say, John, the Clean Water Act did not directly address climate change, but the impacts in the Hudson Valley are absolutely noticeable and important. Millions of dollars of damage have been inflicted on homes and businesses and infrastructure from sea level rise, and particularly storm surges. We're seeing more and more intense storms throughout the region, throughout the world. And those are just wiping out homes and waterfronts and flooding people's businesses. And you know, we've seen it over and over again. The 100-year flood, you know, becomes the 5-year flood. New York State is taking a leadership role in addressing this. They've developed regulations that identify, you know, what are the sea level rise projections for different parts of the state and for the Hudson Valley. We've worked with the Department of Environmental Conservation to develop something called the sea level rise mapper, so that people can make different assumptions about how severe climate change is going to be in the future, and see what impact it's going to have on a water body near them and even their home and waterfront and park and business. We're seeing the impacts on our parks, and we're having to change the design of them. We're having to, you know, ensure that they're not going to wash away. Scenic Hudson has created dozens of parks right along the Hudson, and for years and now generations, we've been making the Hudson available through these beautiful places, whether it's in Irvington or Beacon or Haverstraw, places where people can go down and put their feet in the water and fish, but those places are now threatened. And so we're having to change the design and make sure that they don't get washed away, and that they are sustainable waterfronts.
Well, and Tracy, staying on that issue of climate change and its impacts on the Hudson, one of the concerns is that, you know, there are more than 100,000 residents of the Hudson Valley that get their drinking water from the Hudson. Obviously, it's filtered, but it's filtered only for certain things. A growing problem is the salt front moving up from the estuary further north and further north on the Hudson, meaning that the salinity of those persons' drinking water is growing. What do we do about that?
Yeah, that is a very serious concern, and something that that the team here at Riverkeeper, you know, is working with those communities. We've helped organize the drinking water communities, which are from Poughkeepsie North. There's 7 of them, and they formed a group now called the Hudson 7, so they can have a voice and be really actively engaged in protecting their drinking water. So, you know, the catch with a lot of these things is we can't manage what we don't measure. And the Clean Water Act has a beautiful, really simple little diagram that shows how it works. And it's basically measure conditions, identify problems, put strategies to address the problems into place, measure again, see how you're doing, adjust your strategy, you know, see how it works, measure again. But if you're not doing that measuring piece, you can't identify your problems, you can't put strategies into place, and you certainly won't have any strategies to measure for success. So right now, you know, that applies to this example that you gave, the saltwater wedge. There is no study right now showing how the salt wedge is moving up the Hudson. And for people who don't know, on the call, this is one of the impacts of sea level rise, is that as the sea rises and we get more impacts from the ocean, the salinity line within the Hudson, which usually stays south of Poughkeepsie, is going to creep up. And if we get into salinity within those drinking water pipes, that is actually what triggered the crisis in drinking water in Flint, Michigan. It triggers a much quicker corrosion to the pipes. In that case, you know, a switch to another drinking water supply to try and address it. But again, doing it at the 11th hour. So we're definitely in a cycle where we're really measuring these impacts way after they already are having harm on our communities. And another great example of that for drinking water is PFAS, or these new, category of forever chemicals, PFOAs, PFAS. These are chemicals that have been pumped into our environment from Teflon coating and firefighting foam and fire retardant coatings for years and years and years. And the federal government hasn't been updating the chemicals to test in drinking water to keep up with the new chemicals that industry produce and introduce into our environment. And by the time we find them in places like Newburgh, surface water, drinking water supply, and the crisis that they're having now there, we're discovering they're pervasive. They've reached maybe every surface drinking water supply in America. I mean, this is going to be a huge issue. And now it's a game of catch up. Same with 1,4-dioxane. So there's a lot of stressors. Some are triggered by climate. Some are triggered by lack of regulation. But really the key, to tie it back to tonight's theme, is we have to do the monitoring. We have to do the measuring. And it's beholden on New York State to do this work. I mean, New York does get credit around the PFAS issue, that we are moving forward and starting to create state standards because there aren't federal standards. So without that measurement and knowing what the target is, how can they address the problem? We are still waiting for New York State to step up in terms of nutrients. The Hudson River is the most high nutrient waterway, fresh waterway in North America, and that's going to bring a host of other problems and stressors around, algae and low oxygen and fish die off. And we don't have criteria yet to say what is the right level. Let's start measuring this. Let's not wait until we have disasters and then play catch up. So, it's always more cost effective to address these issues and do the monitoring early on. And I'll just make one final point, because I could go on about this topic for quite a while, because Riverkeeper, as you know, does a lot of water quality monitoring. And we're always working on these issues with the state. We would like the state to take the data that's generated by our academic researchers and not-for-profits like Riverkeeper and use that where they don't have data. And right now, they don't use this community-generated data, and it could be a really valuable, at least an indicator of where there's a need for them to do monitoring, even if they don't want to take the data at the face of it. But in these situations where you're dealing with big problems that are going to cost potentially a lot of money to fix, to some degree, ignorance is bliss. So, you're kind of, burning up time to get at the results because we don't want to see the problem. And that is something that we really have to change if we're going to protect our drinking water supplies and all the other water resources that we have in this region. So I'll leave it at that.
David, one of the things that Clearwater has that is unique is you have, boots on the ground, so to speak, or fins on the water, however you want to define it. You've got people with the sloop and others in your group who are physically out there on the river on a daily basis. It'll be interesting to see during this first summer when you're the chief there, if you can, what you learn about literally the sea level rising on the Hudson, because it's a huge issue. We're working on a film about how communities are dealing with this or not dealing with it. And the scientists from Lamont Doherty said to us, communities that are dealing with climate change and preparing now, they might be okay. If you're not preparing now, you're already in trouble. So I'll be interested. I know you've spent time on the river. I'm curious, so what your observations are.
Well, one thing we're making sure we do is we real indoor education programs, climate change and river effect, and making sure that people are aware and educated and learning while they're out there and imagining what that means and what that looks like. One of our big concerns, and really what should be everyone's big concern, and I know our partner organizations feel this way as well, is that solutions will be, resources will be applied, solutions will be worked upon. And in those efforts, we need to make sure that we're treating our riverfront communities equitably. And we need to make sure that all communities of whatever economic status and whatever people are populated there are looked at equitably, and we're doing our best to take care of all of our citizens and communities along the river. So we're very focused on that environmental justice factor and making sure that there's voice to that, and we're making our efforts in that regard.
I do a lot of commuting as part of the work, and so I drive across the various bridges that cross the Hudson on a regular basis. And every time I cross the river, no matter the weather, if it's stormy and dark or beautiful morning, I'm stunned by how beautiful that river is and the valley is. And that lasts till about the time I get across the bridge. And then I'm reminded, oh shoot, PCBs. Commercial fishing is gone. It destroys me. I mean, every time I look at the river, I think, imagine what it would be like today if you still had a vital, vibrant commercial fishing business on the Hudson. And we could make a laundry list of other concerns. So the Clean Water Act has done a pretty good job, but we've still got some pretty serious issues. I know, Ned, that Scenic Hudson just issued a big new report on PCBs. I know that's something that all of you have been working on for a number of years. Given that, where do you find hope, and what do you kind of count on in these next years to amend those things that we all know are still harming the river?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that, John, since you mentioned the report that Scenic Hudson just issued on Hudson River PCBs. And this is, as you said, an issue that Riverkeeper and Clearwater and Scenic Hudson and Natural Resource Defense Council, Sierra Club, the big fights, we all come together, we rally, we mobilize our members, and it's where our missions overlap that I think we have that great strength. So Scenic Hudson just last week issued a report that documented the long-term harm that General Electric's PCBs in the Hudson have caused, going back 75 years, which was when they stopped dumping PCBs in the upper Hudson from their two factories. But it's projected to continue for another half century, at least, probably another 70 years. But we do have hope because the law is on our side. We've made progress by working together, getting GE to conduct a hotspot cleanup in the upper Hudson and to remove some of the PCBs, but unfortunately, they left roughly 2/3 of the contaminants in the river. Where EPA has just announced that they are opening another 5-year review of whether the cleanup did the job. We know it didn't. And so I know that Tracy and David and I and our teams are going to be working together to ensure that there is a hard look at the data that shows that the fish are not recovering at the rates that EPA and GE imagine. And that's under the cleanup provisions of the federal Superfund law. But then there is another provision under that law called the natural resource damages. And that enables us to put a dollar figure on the damages that have been caused and to require GE to compensate the public through trustee agencies for that damage and to take tangible actions to restore the river. So I know we're all going to be working together to make sure our trustees, which is New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and federal agencies, to come together and say, okay, GE, it's time for restoration and to work toward a settlement and to do additional dredging in the Upper Hudson, but also do a number of actions that would heal the river, ultimately, restore that commercial fishery, enable our kids to not just be able to catch a fish and have to throw it back, but to be able to cook it on an open fire and enjoy the fruits of the river, to be able to drink water from the Hudson without concerns about toxics like PCBs in the river that have to be filtered out. These are basic human rights that people along the river should be able to enjoy. And we know that despite health warnings from the state and federal government, people of color, the poorest people living along the river, sustain themselves on Hudson River fish. Immigrant groups, people of color, who this is their source of protein, and no sign that says don't eat the fish is going to change their behavior. We need to get a clean river, and we're not going to give up until we achieve that.
Well, I can remember being at a meeting in Poughkeepsie held by representatives of the EPA, in which they kind of admitted after a little grilling that after their testing, that this was a few years back, maybe 5 years ago, after their testing, they admitted that it could be a century before it was safe to eat X number of fish a week from the Hudson. So I appreciate the optimism and the stick-to-itiveness. In some regards, I don't know how you guys do it, because some of these things must leave you kind of wanting to just bang your head against the wall, because they're so arduous and take so long. I don't know, David, what do you think when people ask you about the health of the Hudson River? How do you respond?
I mean, I think Ned summed it up really well, right? That we've come a long way, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. And the other thing that I keep thinking about that we should all stay cognizant to is, when you make these positive changes, it only benefits everybody, and you realize it when you get to that endpoint. So there's never any argument of what it could be a detriment to goes away after you've achieved these positive goals with water quality and environment, even economics. So staying the course and not being content. We're not cleaned up yet. We have a long ways to go, although we're much better than we were in 1972. And we always will, because you never know where the next round of policymakers will take things. So the pressure always has to stay there, and we always have to work together, and we always have to try to keep as much of the majority concerned about it and voicing their opinion, so that we can continue on a positive course.
And how can ordinary persons make a difference other than joining your respective groups? What kind of actions can the man on the street take in this regard? Because they do seem like kind of especially using PCBs as an example. I mean, that goes back now, 50 years and still with no real end in sight. What you guys are hopeful because you study the literature and you pay a lot of attention, but the man on the street, I think they're probably confused. Is the river clean? Can you swim in it? Can you eat the fish? Kind of uncertain.
If I could take a stab at, I mean, so one of the things that we're really excited about, the educators we usually have on the Sloop are younger people, and they really get engaged, and they get excited, and they take it forward. And what I'm learning since I've come on board, and I've only been with Clearwater since January, is how many people speak to that experience as how it's affected their life. So it's changed their sense of priority when they look at water quality in the river and the environment in regards to other things that they care about. So one thing that's important is getting people down to the river, getting people out to see just how beautiful the Hudson River is. I mean, it's spectacular. You think of the Hudson River artist of the 18th and 19th century that depicted this beautiful place we have. That's our backyard. But the other thing is as far as how can adults, as they come along, what can they do? Stay active in events that are taking place, because that volume of people speaks to the concern, and that we need to take action. You can take specific action by going to any one of our 3 websites and having an opportunity to communicate to your policymakers. So that's obviously a very powerful way to stay involved and stay engaged. And then there are other opportunities. Earth Day is coming up. How often do we hear that people get out for Earth Day and they do their cleanups, or they participate in some event that's taking place? Clearwater's listing a bunch of events that are taking place in the region over this Earth Day week and weekend. So you could go to there and participate in these things, because the more people involved, the more we all realize that we're working together for this cause. And every person has a circle, sphere of influence where they're influencing other people in this regard as well. So yeah, staying involved is really important. Get down to the river, appreciate it, and work for a clean environment.
David, I've got one follow-up for you. I've had good fortune and traveled around the world quite a bit, a lot on ocean beaches, etc. And everywhere I go around the world, seemingly everyone I meet has a Jacques Cousteau story. Okay. Similarly, here in the Hudson Valley, everybody who lives in the Hudson Valley and pays attention to these issues, especially, has a Pete Seeger story.
Yeah.
Now that you're the executive director of Clearwater, I'm going to ask you for your Pete Seeger story. You got it, even if you have to make it up.
No, I'm not. I'm gonna actually read a quote of Pete Seeger's back from 1970, when he's talking about let's head down to DC and speak to Congress. He said, "We're going to Washington because the problems of the American rivers can't be solved by people like me who live on them. Only the federal government has the power to enact and enforce the laws that are needed." Pete Seeger, 1970. And because think about how a water system flows, a whole watershed, right? It doesn't care about state boundaries. It cares about place, and it follows its way all the way to the ocean. So it affects across state lines. Federal government has to be involved. State governments have to be involved. The other story that I had that I just got yesterday, which I thought was interesting, so I'm gonna tell this one. So again, the sloop was designed for commerce on the river, right? So it's not really an ocean designed vessel. But when it took that sail, and I talked to someone who was actually on it for the sail down to the Thomann, and they're out on the ocean waters, and with the larger surf, the waves were crashing over the bow and over the gunnels of the boat, and they actually had to rig a rope so that you could get to the head of the boat, which, for those who aren't familiar with that term, that's how you use the bathroom while you're out at sea. And the only way to get there, because of its location, was to hold on to this rope and to get there safely. So I thought that was an interesting story. But the one thing that Pete Seeger as founder, what he had a unique quality for, right, was gathering people. And if you ever watch any of his performances, a key thing that he always wanted to do was get the audience to sing with him, right? And when the audience sings together, you're in unison and you're caring about the same thing at the same time. And that spirit is what we need in the environmental movement.
Part of the passage of the Clean Water Act came with a pretty sizable chunk then. I think it was $24 billion to go after a variety of cleanups across the country. Money is a part of all of these issues. Tracy, Ned, maybe you can talk to us about this bond act that's coming the vote that's coming this November, that I think that now the ask is for upwards of $4 billion to help support environmental concerns. Do we know exactly, is there a laundry list of things to go after with, if that law passes or that bond act passes? Is there a laundry list of things that you guys are lining up to go after?
Sure, I'll answer that, and I want to add one thing to your what can regular people do question too, because I'm seeing that in the chat from our guests. And I also have a Pete and Toshi story that I'll have to tell David some other time. So yeah, one of the things when you ask what people can do, the first thing that came to mind for me was in November, vote for this Environmental Bond Act. It was increased this year by the governor. So it is at 4.2 billion, but it doesn't exist unless the voters come out in November and vote yes on it. And if they do, it is going to be a major opportunity. It's not money you get to spend all at once. We kind of access it over many years, but it will be a real important lever for moving forward towards the state climate goals and actually putting infrastructure improvements on the ground. One of the areas that we really need a lot of help with is our stormwater infrastructure and making sure that our rivers do their natural function and that they flow and they provide buffers for inland flooding that we'll see more of, and that they provide habitat for fish. And those waterways are under a lot of stress. Some of what this bond will do that Riverkeeper is very interested in is helping to accelerate our dam removal efforts to make our rivers more free flowing and help the fish that are really struggling with loss of habitat, as well as pressures from warming waterways and all the other changes we're experiencing. And I'll just put in one plug on something everyone can do in addition to voting for the Bond Act. I mentioned earlier that the Hudson River is a high nutrient waterway and that can pose a lot of risks. And as our waterways warm, it makes it harder. Warm water doesn't hold oxygen as well as cold water. So you start to get more on that edge of having sufficient oxygen for fish to live in and for us to keep streams and the main Hudson full of marine life. So reducing lawn fertilizer, don't use lawn fertilizer, or if you are using it and you feel like you have to, you really only need to do it twice a year at a maximum. And that, I believe it's like Mother's Day and Memorial Day, or Labor Day are the rules of thumb, because the nutrients are, the rain takes the nutrients from fertilizer off of your lawn and puts it into your local storm drain that just dumps it right into the nearest stream and takes it to the Hudson. And that is compiling this problem of high nutrients. So it's really something simple people can do. If you have landscapers, tell them you don't want them to fertilize your lawn. They're actually incentivized because they get paid to do the labor and they get a markup on the fertilizer. So you really have to be explicit, and it's something very small that'll have a big impact, just like voting for the Bond Act.
Well, and yeah, that's right. And begs the question of, can money make a difference? And if it's used correctly, it does. I mean, a bunch of this ARPA money from the federal government is going to sewage and water treatment plants, et cetera. Hopefully it's all spent right. But Ned, what about Scenic Hudson? You have a list for the Bond Act monies?
Yeah, we're very excited about it, John. Thanks. And many of the things that Tracy just mentioned are on our list as well, but we're of course about preserving land along the Hudson, and there would be very significant funds for that, as well as for farmland preservation. And Scenic Hudson has preserved over 130 working farms in the valley that provide fresh, healthy produce to our local farmers markets and grocery stores and restaurants. And part of what we're working to do, and that there's also funding in this year's state budget for, and would be in the Bond Act, is helping farmers shift from conventional practices to regenerative practices, those that would, instead of allowing carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases to become a problem that's driving global climate change, let's keep the carbon in the plants and in the soil and in the roots and in the trees. And so there's funding in the Bond Act for that, as there is in this year's great state environmental budget. And Scenic Hudson has created an organization called the Northeast Carbon Alliance that is bringing together farmers and scientists and land managers and people who are working along the estuary and in wetlands preservation and forest preservation and carbon management and all those contexts, so that we can look for natural solutions to climate change. And people can get involved. People can, as David said, check out all of our websites. We're also working together to fight a power plant, a new fossil fuel power plant on the river, just a few miles north of Storm King. There's a proposal on the waterfront for that. It's called Dan Scammer. We've got a site, Stop Dan Scammer, and we would like to see a new generation of renewable energy and investment in resiliency. And there's a lot of funding in the Bond Act for that. So people should learn about it. We'll be campaigning for it. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors. As November gets closer, people have to turn over the ballot and check the box for yes on the Bond Act. And those funds have a huge return on investment in jobs, as well as in a clean environment and in stopping climate change.
The Bond Act is $4.2 billion. It's a tricky time to be asking the public for spending more tax dollars. So you're right, it's going to take a lot of effort to both educate the public as to what it is and how do you do it. It's one of those things that could easily be overlooked. Tracy, what are you curious about with Ned's job there at Scenic Hudson?
Oh, let's see. What am I curious about Ned's job?
I mean, you all kind of do the same job, but in a much different, in a variety of different ways. Since you guys don't hang out that much together, not because you don't get along, but just this, I thought it'd be an interesting opportunity to maybe ask each other what's up.
Yeah, well, one place where Ned's team has been doing some work that's always of interest, and where I get an opportunity to learn and track things that we're also really concerned about, is the climate impacts analysis and that on the ground community work. So we're very interested in dam removal and restoration of river shorelines, both the Hudson, but also on the tributary rivers, and kind of the state of our riparian buffers, plantings along the rivers that keep them shaded. So I'd be interested in hearing kind of what is the latest round of research or best practices, knowledge you might be dropping on us all, Ned, from your house, about how we're doing with our climate preparedness.
Well, Tracy, that's something that we've been working with the Department of Environmental Conservation for some time, and we've worked at multiple levels. I mentioned our solar mapper, which helps people sort of find the right place to put solar in communities, but we also have a tool on our website that enables people to see what the impact of climate change, and I mentioned this earlier, on their local water bodies is, and how can we create zoning and master plans around that. I actually misspoke earlier. I was talking about our solar mapper, but we have a sea level rise mapper as well. And both those tools can help communities plan for both mitigating climate change and to plan for resiliency. And so we've seen, we have this photograph that I often show people of the Rondout area of Kingston, where Riverkeeper has an office, and Clearwater keeps the Sloop, and Scenic Hudson is preserved land right on the Rondout. And so all of us have a hub there, but that area is underwater during many of the superstorms. And so one of the things that we're doing is getting communities along the Hudson, whether it's Piermont or Kingston or the town of Catskill, village of Catskill, and look at what are going to be the impacts of rising sea level and these storm surges on the areas where zoning master plans currently allow development, and how can we change that? In the Rondout, right across the street from your office, is the sewage treatment plant for Kingston. And so we've helped the city of Kingston get funding to prevent that from getting inundated during these storm events. So, and then, you know, as you mentioned, all of our parks along the river, we're working on how do we plan those to be more adaptive, more resilient, you know, not hard-edged, so that they are assimilative and buffers when we have the rising sea level and storm events.
Ned, you've been in your job for what, 23 years there at Scenic Hudson?
Yeah, 23 years, yeah.
David's been in his job at Clearwater for about 6 months.
I'm still in my first 90 days, but yeah.
Well, I was kind of curious, Ned, if you had any, because the job can be can have some frustrations. There's a lot of good efforts out there, but it can be a slog. So I'm curious, Ned, if you had any advice for David as he kind of looks ahead towards his next couple decades.
Well, what Clearwater is so good at is educating young people and getting them out on the river. I remember one of your programs is Women at the Helm.
Mhm.
I love that.
Empowerment programs, yep.
What's that?
One of our youth empowerment programs, yes.
Yeah. So I have a daughter. She's now 25, but she got out on the Clearwater when she was a young girl, and that was inspirational. And my wife Tara was involved with the Quadricentennial. She was the executive director of the Quadricentennial and worked with Clearwater and the skippers back then, and in the ships, tall ships and historical ships going up the river. And you know, that was just an inspirational moment for my family and for my daughter. So I just think really leaning into healing into that core function of Clearwater is I think the path to success for you. That's just my thoughts for your future.
I appreciate that very much, and I look forward to working with you as we move forward on this. We're lucky. Our board passed a new strategic plan in December, and very much focused on that our core in education is critical, and we need to keep that going. And the unique opportunity that you have when you do it on the Sloop, it's just fantastic, right? You get out on the river, and to learn out there is just special, especially considering just how beautiful the Hudson is, which is such a great thing. You know, the other two things that I think about in regards to how people can stay involved, Ned, you mentioned the solar mapping project, but people staying involved with their municipalities, and what are your municipalities doing? Because it matters at that level as much as it does regional, state, and federal level. And so you really have an opportunity there to promote something like, is your municipality participating in the solar mapping project? The other thing is that we feel is really important too. Again, we get people to the river, they care more about it. So our docksides, our riverfront communities that are creating parks and trying to figure out how those parks, as Ned mentioned earlier, will survive the sea level rise and the water level rise because of climate change. But they're really important, and there are projects being done to be resilient in how new docks are built and how those parks will work, so that they stay viable. And that's really an important part as well, that people can take advantage of because it's right there. It's at their local community level.
David, you referenced earlier the fact that one of the ways to get people engaged and to keep people engaged is for them literally to have access to the river, right? That's one of my big issues, is that the more people use, the cleaner the river gets, the better shape it's in, the more people use it. We still suffer from a lack of access to a certain degree, but it comes at an odd time because you're trying to encourage people not to build on the coastline because of this fear of rising sea levels, but at the same time we want people to go down to the river. So it's a balancing act.
And again, I'm going to restate, we also want everybody to be able to get there. So we really want to make sure our solutions are geared to equity and inclusion and getting everybody the same opportunity to get to the river.
Yeah, and Ned, Scenic Hudson was very instrumental in helping to create a new state park, which has an opening when?
On Saturday.
On Saturday. Good
Yeah.
timing. Good timing. Earth
Yeah,
Day.
it's in Kingston, and we're gonna drop something into the chat box so people can see it. It's called the Sojourner Truth State Park. We've also got information on our website under events. So check it out. We'd love it's going to be at 11 o'clock, 11 to 2. It's a 520 acre former industrial site that is rewilding. We're helping encourage it to return to nature after years of industrial activity, from brick making to natural cement to Portland cement, ice making. There were giant 130-foot cement silos that we've taken down. So we're really excited about it and hope people come on Saturday or just check it out. This is going to be an event sponsored by our partner, the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, which actually now owns the site, and by New York State Parks. And this has been a great partnership. The mayor and the city of Kingston have been great partners. There's a beautiful Water's Edge Trail that's part of the Empire State Trail. So this is going to be a great place for the public from Saturday onward.
Yeah, and it's the 500 acres that run north of Kingston on the west side of the river. This is a logistical question. How do you access the park? Because I've been to both ends, and there's not. Have you created big parking areas as well?
There's going to be a parking lot in the middle of the park now. You can also access it via John Street in East Kingston. The north end of the Brickyard Trail is I think it's 200 John Street in Kingston. But there will be we've got information on our web. It should be in the Dropbox right now. So it'll be accessible, and information on our web should help people get there.
Yeah, you kind of quietly knocked down those 130-foot cement silos.
Yep.
All of a sudden, they're no longer on the horizon.
Yep. And we've had great consultation with the community, with the mayor, with the county executive. Everybody's been involved, and so it's free entry, great Earth Day celebration. There's going to be music and educational activities for kids. It should be a lot of fun, and it's a demonstration, the kind of thing that does give me hope, John, that we can restore Mother Nature, that we can undo some of the damage that has been done over generations. We celebrate the members of the labor force that worked there. We celebrate the indigenous people that originally inhabited that area, the Lenape people, but now is an opportunity for healing and restoration, and it begins on Saturday.
And Tracy, Riverkeeper does an annual sweep that's coming up soon.
Yeah, May 7th. So, one big water topic that I'm sure our guests are all familiar with is marine debris and all the plastics getting into our oceans. And, they start in the streams and the creeks and the rivers, and that's how they get there. So participating in the sweep on May 7th, which there's a link in the chat now. People can pick their area and pull teams together, and Riverkeeper provides all the resources to implement the sweep and help that happen. We get thousands of people out across the watershed, taking a big bite out of our marine debris from our communities before it makes it into the river and out to the ocean. So that's another great way for people to get involved. So we hope people will sign up who You might already have a sweep in your community, so it might just be looking on the map and signing up for one that's happening, or you could set one up.
Well, I'm just going to jump around a little bit because a lot of subjects have come up that I wasn't really planning on, but I've got to follow up. Ned, you mentioned that dance camera was still a concern. I think the public at large is going to think that when the new governor came in, she disallowed their permit, but you're suggesting they made an appeal, and then they're going to try and open it anyway?
Yes, that's exactly right, John. We had a really enlightened decision by the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation under Governor Hochul, Basil Sagos, and he denied the permit, and this is the first in history. He cited the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, New York State's nationally significant climate law, and its provisions that relate to new power plants, and that cannot be net emitters of carbon emissions. And the Danskammer plant would absolutely be a net new source of carbon emissions as well as toxic pollutants for Newburgh and Beacon and the entire region. And we'd see those pollutants, sweep across the Northeast, just as that St. Lawrence cement plant that we fought together years ago would have. Despite the decision by New York State, Danskammer has appealed both through an administrative process and through the courts. And in fact, Haley Carlock, who is leading the charge for Scenic Hudson in this battle, she spent all day today, it was her birthday today, and notwithstanding that, she spent all day today in a hearing arguing against Danskammer's efforts to keep the project alive. So people should tune in, go to the website, Stop Danskammer, stop the plant, and join the efforts to persuade New York State to stick with its guns, persuade the courts to be on our side, and help us move toward renewable energy, not a fracked gas power plant.
Yeah, to me, that's such a no-brainer in that New York has this very ambitious climate legislation, which if we would just fund it, has a great future. And projects like Danskammer just simply don't fit in that long-term vision. So I'm not quite sure how it could possibly be allowed, but then again, you never know. Tracy, I got to follow up. We've been talking a lot about the relationship between humans and the waterway, but we can't forget that it's home to a lot of wildlife. I've been talking recently with folks from the DEC and a couple of your folks, George Jackman at Riverkeeper, about the return of the migrating fish and efforts to return even more. I've been reading about these kind of horrific invasives, these goby fish. I mean, how much of your energy are spent on keeping the water clean for the wildlife as well as for man and woman?
A lot of it. And, fortunately, the things that threaten the fish often are the same thing that threatens the people. So you can kind of make that human connection to get people to care and help the fish as well. Like one great example of that is, closing Indian Point. Indian Point is actually an example of a battle that was won based on the Clean Water Act. They were denied Clean Water Act permits because they were using the Hudson River to cool their nuclear core. Instead of building those separate iconic nuclear cooling towers, they were just sucking in the Hudson River, killing billions of fish and fish larvae a year, and really just externalizing the cost of running their business on the Hudson River. So that was a real, just decades long, incredible destroyer of marine life, having that plant operating there. And in the end, their unwillingness to stop that practice and take that expense on in their own business model was their undoing. So, the signature fish of the Hudson are definitely, in decline and under a lot of stress. So One of the things that we're looking to grow as part of our work to address that is really ramping up our dam removal efforts. Letting the fish get up to their natal waterways and complete their reproductive cycle for the fish that are dependent on that is hugely important to try and, help lift up these species that are threatened. So, and then at the other end of things, John, you mentioned the invasive species. So we have pressure from invasive species that have already made their way into the Great Lakes. So specifically the round goby got into the Hudson River through the Erie Canal. And that is a fish that eats a lot of fish eggs. So again, it's another big stressor on our native fish species, ironically, similar to what Indian Point had been doing before we got that shut down. So our next big threat in that regards is the Asian carp, and the Asian carp will come through and just eat living fish as well as fish larvae and are just, voracious invasive fish. So we're currently working with the state calling for a barrier at the Erie Canal where boats coming through would actually have to be, lifted out like they lift boats in and out of water at boat yards. They would be lifted out and taken, cleaned down and moved from one side of the barrier to the other instead of using the lock system, because we do know that Asian carp and other invasive carp can get through a lock system. So it's really at the center of our work. You mentioned we were founded by fishermen who were trying to keep the recreational, commercial rather, fisheries going and preserve a way of life. And that battle was lost a long time ago, but the Hudson still functions as a really critical nursery for fish all along the eastern seaboard. They come in here to reproduce and to spend the early phases of their life, depending on what species. So it's a really sacred charge and responsibility for all of us to think about those creatures and the rights of nature, as well as the rights of humans in this work.
I asked a marine biologist with the DEC just last week about how marine life in the river has changed since the closing of Indian Point, because I never remember if it's 1 billion fish larvae a year or 2 billion, but we're cycled through their intake system there. It's too early to tell, he said.
Yeah. So the shad, which are one of our iconic fish, have not bounced back. So there is a worry that the shad may go extinct, at least in the Hudson. The sturgeon are also not doing well. And now, we saw some really big die-offs the past couple summers. We saw bunkers, or also called Manhattan, dying off because of the low oxygen conditions brought about by high nutrients and warming. And that is, the high nutrients are triggered, I mentioned, by lawn fertilizer, but also by our sewage treatment plants and our communities not repairing sewers and all the really unacceptable sewage leaks and combined sewer overflows that still happen, that really shouldn't happen in a wealthy country like America, that we still are not managing our waste. So yeah, there's a lot of stress on the species, and it's hard, it's too soon to tell, but we're certainly prioritizing and doing, using every tool at our disposal to help our friends who have to live in the water and don't have the choice of, if I get in, will I get sick? Where do I go in? When do I go in? That's just where they live.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to move. Yeah.
Yeah.
And at Clearwater, David, what have you got coming up this Earth Day weekend?
We've got a whole, we're trying to share a whole host of events that a lot of organizations are throwing for the weekend, and it's up on our webpage so people can check that out and try to get involved themselves. We are also, anyone that's on staff or involved with Clearwater are going to share what we're doing individually throughout the region over the weekend. So follow our social media. You'll see lots of posts of great ideas and things you can do to participate and be out on the water. So we're excited for the week.
And are you guys buying into my my non-scientific, non-empirical calculation that there are more environmental activists per capita in the Hudson Valley, or am I alone in that?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I think it's very possible without seeing data on it.
Yeah. And David, you were last at Mohonk. How does it compare being on the river versus taking care of the river versus taking care of a big, beautiful landscape like
Yeah.
Mohonk?
I mean, I had the best of both worlds. I can't complain one bit, but I've always been a big water person. I can't think of anything better than being on my pack canoe or kayak out on the water. So I'm thrilled to be here and looking forward to the sailing season up and coming.
Well, I'm kind of curious. We talked a little bit about hope. Maybe recycle through and give me a sense of what, since we do celebrate this Earth Day, what now become Earth Week and Earth Month and Earth Year. What gives you optimism in jobs that can be occasionally, more than occasionally, frustrating?
I'll take a quick step. So we just talked earlier about celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act and the successes that were accomplished through that. So what we have to do is we have to do the things now that give us something to celebrate in 50 years from here.
And David, what would those be? Like more legislation? Is it a legislative?
Well, I think things like what we just mentioned, like find true solutions and apply your efforts to it. So that's through legislation, that's through the Environmental Bond Act, that's through the federal infrastructure money that was just passed. Make sure there's appropriate channeling of that infrastructure money to things like sewer systems and riverfront communities that are trying to be resilient for climate change, and that we're pushing for those solutions and resources.
Well, in 1972, when they were debating the passage of the Clean Water Act, Richard Nixon very proudly announced that he was an environmentalist. He said so. He just didn't like the cost. He thought it was too expensive. His then head of the EPA, William Ruckelshaus, responded, "Well, if we're cheap on this, we're going to cheat people out of a future by taking away clean water." And they specifically addressed the ability to fish and to swim. Now I'll go back to my almost daily drives across the bridge and being concerned about swimmable and fishable waters, which is one of the goals of the Clean Water Act that we're celebrating. I'd kind of like from you guys to, sell me, convince me that we're doing the right thing, and not that I doubt, but I'd kind of like to be sold on what we're doing to make a difference.
Well, John, we've mentioned the Bond Act. The state environmental budget is historic, not just because we have the biggest environmental bond act ever, but also because the Environmental Protection Fund has gone up $100 million to $400 million. The State Parks Fund has gone up from 120 million to 250 million, with funds for critical projects in the Hudson Valley, such as the Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail and restoration of beaches at Lake Sebago and in Harriman State Park. I think we've got leadership in New York State. They get it. The governor proposed, the former governor proposed a $3 billion bond act. Governor Hochul proposed $4 billion. The Senate proposed $6 billion. I think the Assembly proposed $5 billion. They were kind of competing with each other as to who could get the biggest environmental bond act. So we've got the commitment at the state level. We have great organizations like Riverkeeper and Clearwater, and people are rallying with us. They're showing up at the Dan Scammer hearings. We have great congressional representatives like Paul Tonko, who has proposed the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act, which would allocate $50 million a year for coordinated restoration projects throughout the Hudson and the tributaries in New York and New Jersey. So there are opportunities for people to get behind today's Clean Water Act, today's actions, federal and state and local, that are going to restore their waterways. I saw somebody asked a question about the Greenway and whether the Greenway, Hudson Valley Greenway, was still around, and they are. And they're a great great partner. The estuary program, I think, got a little more funding this year. We're going to be saying farewell to a real hero of the Hudson, Fran Dunwell, who's led that program for some decades and who's retiring. But there's a great team still there. So I think there's really a great opportunity for people to get out and help their communities get renewables. We see a lot of opposition to solar projects, but Scenic Hudson has waded into those to try to bring developers and the communities together so we get the win-win, so we get the renewable, so that we can say no to dance scammer and yes to solar. So people are, there are great opportunities for people to choose the issue in their community or their region that they think is going to make a difference, get behind it, support the elected officials that understand it, the issue, and that are going to fight with them.
Thanks, Ned. That was good sales job. I like that. Let that stand as Ned's closing. David, you want to chime in?
I mean, I think Ned said it really well. I'm going to restate, I think one of the things we all have to try to find is the time through the noise of just the busyness of life these days, and to keep it a focus and a priority so people do make it important when they look at everything they're trying to deal with. And we want to keep that moving forward. And again, I'd restate that there's so many opportunities to take action really locally that help support how we can change and move forward. And when we discuss climate change, we have to talk about climate solutions, because that's where the answer lies, and we need to support that changeover. And like Ned mentioned, as far as dance scammer versus moving into creative ways to apply solar and renewables, there is only one choice. There's one choice that makes sense in all regards, and that's in the renewable side. And we just need to keep plugging along.
And Tracy, you have heads up for it?
So, you asked a moment ago about hope for the future. So I think I'm going to kind of frame mine around that. I want to acknowledge that there is an incredible young generation coming up. And one of the things that's really changed and is changing our landscape is our racial awakening in America, and the awareness that there is structural racism that's been baked into how we've built our communities and how we function as organizations and everything we do. And it's really stunning if you look to see that you can draw a direct line from redlining that happened in communities through the real estate assessments of the past decades and the environmental justice communities now, the communities that all the polluting infrastructure is situated in. But my hope really lies in the fact that not only is this becoming more a part of the conversation and all of our mandates to when we talk about a just transition, to make sure that this next round of infrastructure investments that we are being forced to undertake because of the urgency of climate change, that we have this lens now as we make this next major historic generational investment in reconceiving our communities. And I'm hopeful because not only do I see it, in my kids' generations, in the young people who work in my organization, how this is so front and center in the way they look at the world, that helps remind us older leaders and folks to stay in that lens and that awareness. And also the Biden administration has put amazing executive orders out calling on all the federal agencies to look at how they've been investing and how they've been setting their priorities, and how structural racism is reflected in that. And I am so interested to see what the Army Corps of Engineers comes back with. The Army Corps of Engineers was here after Superstorm Sandy saying, we got to build walls to keep Wall Street dry. And then the brakes got put on by Donald Trump because he didn't want to invest in New York City. And now they're coming back And they have this executive order from the president. And how will we be looking with a French lens going through this incredible transformation of the past 5 years to, the pause it forced us to do before we make these investments? I think that's really a huge challenge and a source of hope that we'll do better with this round of really urgent and hugely important work, facilitated by the investments that Ned enumerated. So that's, I'm ending on hope.
Great.
If I could have one more moment, I also would like to speak on behalf of all of us to thank you, John. If I could take a minute to do that on behalf of, if now's the moment, on behalf of Ned and David and myself, we just want to thank John Bowermaster, who is one of the most talented and prolific Hudson River storytellers of this time we're living in, just continuing on an incredible legacy of artists and thinkers who've been inspired by the Hudson and the Hudson Valley. So John read our bios. I'll just share briefly a piece of what he has accomplished. He's the founder of Ocean's 8 Films, One Ocean Media Foundation, and the host of the podcast, The Green Radio Hour with John Bowermaster, which you can hear on Radio Kingston, and which also streams online. So John, we want to thank you for giving voice to the work that we do and being a great conduit and storyteller and a part of this work. So it's really been such a joy to have you be guiding our conversation tonight.
That's
I
very,
agree. Thank you, John.
Here, here.
very appreciated. I'll close with my one. I have a few good Pete Seeger stories, but one also involves a certain amount of regret. It's standing in Pete's driveway with him one day, and he was kind of bemoaning the fact that he'd had a tree cutter out at his house the other day, and they had cut down and planed an oak tree, big, beautiful, dead oak tree in his driveway. And he said, "Yeah, I've got this garage full of 8 foot by 10 foot wide, 10 foot long, 8-inch wide, beautifully planed oak planks." And I so regret, he offered them to me. He said, "Well, do you want any?" I didn't have a way to cart them anywhere. So I wished I'd taken them, because then I would have a desk made from Pete Seeger's oak tree, which again, I didn't do. So I guess it's kind of a reverse tip of the hat to Pete. And Ned, did you want to sign us out here?
Okay, well, sure. I think by working together, Riverkeeper, Clearwater, and you, John, we can continue to make great progress. And it's that sense of shared purpose and collaboration, bringing together all the people of the Valley through the lens that Tracy so eloquently spoke of bringing all people, those who've been subject to racism in the past, bring them to the table, empower them, ensure that they are that their voices are raised along with everybody in the Valley. So I am optimistic. I continue to get up with enthusiasm every day, even 23 years after I joined Scenic Hudson, because we have just such an amazing group of dedicated professionals there, and transforming landscapes and preserving them all along the river, but doing it in collaboration with great leaders like Tracy and David. So I'm really excited. I think, Tracy, this was your idea. Thank you for instigating and bringing us together. And I think we should all celebrate and get out on the river in kayaks together.
I agree. I like that idea.
Yeah,
Thank you,
let's
Tracy.
do
I
it.
agree. You did a great job bringing this together, and your team. I appreciate it.
And
Yes.
for any in the audience who are out there who don't pay attention to the various social media efforts by the 3 groups, please do, because there's a ton of great information. Speaking to David's point, though, earlier, is that there maybe sometimes you feel like there's too much information and you can't keep up. That's when you go kayaking.
I have a closing quotation from Bob Boyle, who was
Thank
both
you.
the founder of Riverkeeper and served as vice chair of Scenic Hudson. He called the Hudson the most surprising piece of water on the face of the earth. There is no other river quite like it. So I think we can all agree on that. And Scenic Hudson, Riverkeeper, and Clearwater can recommit themselves to protecting and restoring this most surprising piece of water on the face of the earth.
Great. On that note, thank you. And see you in 1 year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Night,
Okay.
everybody.
And before then,
Thank-
thanks,
thank-
everybody.
Tuned in tonight.
Good night, everybody.